Hi, I'm Professor Cotter. Today we're going to talk about GDP, or Gross Domestic Product. Well, why do we care about GDP? Well, it's the primary measure of a country's wealth. So let's go ahead and define it. GDP is the total market, or dollar value, of all final goods and services produced inside the borders of a country within a given period of time. That's typically a year. All right, so what does it mean then? Well, let's think through a few examples. Are these things part of GDP? Why or why not? Well, dinner at a restaurant, is that GDP? Yes, that's a final service and clearly in the borders of your country. What about dinner at home? Well, no. Why? Because there's not a market value for dinner at home, so it's not counted. But yes, on the groceries, those get counted in GDP. The additional value that came because you turned those groceries into a delicious dinner, not counted in GDP. Construction of an office building. Sure, that's a new building produced inside the borders of your country in the year. That's part of GDP. How about the sale of a 10-year-old house? Nope, not part of GDP. Why? That house was built 10 years ago, not this year. It would have been in GDP 10 years ago, not this year. However, the fee you pay your real estate agent is part of GDP. It's a service. A new car? Sure, that's part of GDP. What about the tires purchased by Ford to put on a new car? The answer is no. Why not? They're not a final good or service. They're an intermediate good. Ford charges you a price for that car that includes the price that they paid for the tires. So if we counted the tires separately, we'd be double counting the pieces of GDP. All right, well, hopefully you get a sense of the kinds of things that are included in GDP. Now, we can break those up into categories. So we typically measure GDP, at least in the United States, using the total amount spent in 4 types of areas. The first is consumption. So think of everything that a household buys, whether it's durable or non-durable or service, all of that's included in GDP consumption. The second category is investment. Now don't get tricked here. This isn't financial investment. We're not talking about your stock portfolio or your crypto portfolio. We're talking about real investment. So think of a business investing in equipment or a new production plant. You can think of a household buying a brand new house. That would be residential investment. Or you can think of inventory, which is also a key component of investment. Anytime a business adds to its inventory, that's counted as part of GDP as part of inventory investment. Later, when they sell the good, inventory goes down, consumption goes up, and those offset each other so that there's no change to GDP. Government purchases. This includes federal, state, and local purchases. So think things like paying for the military, building roads and bridges and airports, your local school district buildings, as well as the employees that provide those services. Their wages are counted as part of GDP. The important thing here to remember is we're not talking about transfer payments. So even though the government spends a lot of money on things like Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, food stamps, WIC, other forms of welfare, those are all transfers, and because they're transfers, they're not part of GDP. An easy way to think about this is, well, consider Social Security. When your grandma gets her Social Security check, what's she going to do with it? She's going to go and pay her rent, buy groceries, maybe go out to eat. We'll count those things in GDP. If we also counted the transfer payment, the Social Security check, we'd be double counting. So we want to make sure not to do that. And then finally, we add in net exports. What do I mean by that? We add in the value of everything produced in the U.S. that we sell to other countries. Those are our exports. And then subtract out the value of everything that was produced in some other country and then imported into the United States. This ensures that we're only counting the value of the goods and services produced inside our country borders. Okay, well, we can find this actual data in FRED. So we're going to go there now. All right, so here we are at the FRED website, fred.stlouisfed.org. We can search for GDP. You'll pull up a lot of different things. This gross domestic product listed here at the top is the one we're looking for. You can verify that's true because GDP in FRED, the one we want, has a code that's really simple. It's just GDP. So there we see right there at the top. Okay, so current GDP in the United States, $29.4 trillion. That's where we stand. You can see it's grown a lot over time. Okay, now there's a few different variations of GDP that we can pay attention to. We're going to cover 3 today. Real GDP versus nominal GDP, growth rates in GDP, and per capita GDP. All right, we'll start with per capita, which is really the simplest. Per capita GDP is just taking our GDP numbers and dividing it by the total population of the country. That'll give us a proxy for the average level of income in a nation. Now keep in mind this is not an income distribution, so it doesn't tell us anything about how the income is split up, just what the average level is. All right, so if we go back here to Fred, we can calculate per capita GDP in a straightforward way. Let's go to Edit Graph. We want to add in some data, so we need population so we can divide by it. Population in Fred is just the code POP, so pretty easy to find. We'll add that, click Add. Now we have this new data series, B, that we can work with. So GDP, which is A, divided by B, population, will be GDP per capita. So down here in formula, we'll type A divided by B, apply the formula. And once we do that, we see, oh, wait a minute, these numbers look very small, 0.04, what's the problem? Well, the problem is our units, which we always have to be careful with when we work with data in Fred. So if we go back here, we look at GDP, the units are billions of dollars. Population, the units are thousands of people. And so I've got a billion divided by 1,000. That's 1 million. That means our units are in millions. And so we can solve our problem here by just multiplying by 1 million. That'll put our units back in dollars. All right, so now I've done that, and we can see our graph here of GDP per capita, or GDP per person. Our most recent reading here last year in quarter 3 of 2024, $86,259. So about $86,000 per person is the average level of income in the United States. Now, the median household income is much lower than that. That's not a surprise because income isn't split evenly in the United States. We have a few individuals with very, very large incomes which skew that distribution. Okay, well, what about growth rates of GDP? Typically, we report these as an annualized quarterly growth rate, at least in the United States. So just to remind you how that's done, we take 1 plus the quarterly growth rate, just the quarter over quarter percentage change, raise that to the 4th power, that is compound it for 4 quarters, and then subtract 1 to find our annualized value. It's pretty straightforward, but if we're in Fred, it's even more straightforward. So when we're in Fred and we have our GDP series looked up, we can just go to Edit Graph and change our units. So our units down here at the bottom have all kinds of options. A compounded annual rate of change is exactly what we're looking for, that annualized quarterly change. Click that, and we've got our compounded annual rate of change already calculated for us. So again, this is GDP per capita. It had an annualized growth rate of 4.1% last quarter. Now finally, there's 2 different ways of thinking about GDP. What we've been looking at so far is nominal. What do I mean by that? Current production measured at current prices. Alternatively, we could look at real GDP. Real GDP would be current production measured at some base year prices. Now, why do we care about real GDP? Well, because if we look at the growth rate of nominal GDP, which we just did, there's 2 different things that can make that growth rate positive. We could be producing more goods and services. That'd be good. That would represent a growing economy. But we could also just have higher prices, inflation, and that wouldn't be so good. Because those 2 things are mixed, growth rates in nominal GDP are not very informative. Real GDP, by holding prices fixed, only goes up if actual production of goods and services goes up, and so changes in real GDP will be a clearer measure of economic growth. Let's go ahead and look at that in Fred. All right, so once we're here at Fred, we can search for real GDP or click on the search term that's right here at the beginning of the page. And what we're looking for is real gross domestic product. It happens to be this first one listed right here. And we can double check that that's what we actually want because the code for real GDP will be GDP C1, which you can see up here at the top. All right, so current measures of real GDP in the United States use a base year of 2017. And we can see in 2017 dollar terms, real GDP is about 23.4 trillion currently. Okay, and we could go ahead and calculate the annualized quarterly growth rate for real GDP, edit graph, go to units, compounded annual rate of change, and then we can see, oh, our most recent growth rate in real GDP is 3.07% on an annual basis. That's a number that will often get reported in the news. So let's go ahead and try to calculate this on our own. I've created a very simple economy. It only has two goods, iPhones and textbooks. If these are the only two goods in our economy, it's pretty straightforward how to calculate GDP. We just need to take the quantity produced of these goods times the price and add it up across those two goods. I've also given you base year prices for some base year that's chosen in the past. So what I'd like to know is what's GDP in 2024 and what's the growth rate of GDP? And then how does that compare to the growth rate in real GDP? So we'll start by calculating GDP. We just need to take quantity times price. So that's pretty straightforward. Quantity of iPhones times price of iPhones. And the same thing, of course, for textbooks. So that'll be, the nominal value, and then the nominal GDP. We just need to add up across our two goods. Add up our textbooks and our iPhones for 2023, and do the same thing for 2024. And now we have a nominal GDP. All right. So what is our nominal GDP in 2024? It's 755,250. Pretty straightforward. What's our growth rate of nominal GDP? Well, it's just our GDP in 2024 divided by our GDP in 2023 minus 1. And so we've got a 13% growth rate of GDP year over year. How does this compare to real GDP? Well, to do that, we need to use the same quantities produced in the year, but multiply those quantities by some base year price. So we've got a base year already. So this is pretty straightforward. Quantity of iPhones in 2023 times the base year price. And then the same thing for textbooks. That'll get us a real value. Now notice in comparison to the nominal value, in both years we're using a price of iPhones of $800, so we're not letting prices change. And then our real GDP across this economy will be just summing up our two goods, iPhones and textbooks. All right, and so now we've got a real GDP in 2024 of 573,500. Now what's the growth rate in real GDP? Again, straightforward. Real GDP in 2024 divided by real GDP in 2023 minus 1 to find the growth rate. And so we have a growth rate in real GDP of 7.6% compared to the growth rate in nominal GDP of 13%. What does that mean? Well, it means we've had inflation, prices have gone up, and looking at our data, we can see that's true. The price of iPhones went up from 800 to 1,000 to 1,050, and the prices of textbooks went up from 100 to 140 to 150. Because prices have gone up, nominal GDP has gone up as well, but not because we produced more goods and services. All right. As we get close to concluding here, it's important to point out that there's limits to this GDP measure. We're trying to measure the quality of life within a country. And GDP is a reasonable measure of that, but it's not a perfect measure. There's some limits. For example, GDP doesn't capture the value of leisure time. It doesn't capture the value of non-market economic activity. So, we talked about preparing dinner in your house. It doesn't capture that, but it doesn't capture lots of other things, like a stay-at-home spouse that takes care of children. It doesn't capture anything about how the environment's being taken care of, or how the resources are distributed. Is there poverty? Is there inequality? And so this is a good starting point to think about how well off a country is doing, but it's not an ending point. If we really want to dive into the well-being of a country, we need to think more deeply about everything else that's happening in the country. This famous quote from Robert Kennedy applies. GDP does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. So the takeaway here, GDP is a great place to start, but it shouldn't be the only thing we look at as we consider the economy. All right, now one final thing I want to point out is now that we've got a measure of GDP, how does the U.S. compare to other countries when we think of this measure? So in nominal terms, the GDP of the U.S. is the largest country's GDP in the entire world. The U.S. makes up a bit over a quarter of the total world's GDP. And you can see that's much larger than all of the European Union combined. It's larger than China, Japan, India, or the UK by a fair magnitude. So the US plays a very major role in the world economy because it makes up such a large part of the world's output. That's despite the fact that the US only represents a bit over 4% of the world's total population. A different way of looking at this is in this figure here. So this is projected GDP for 2025, and you can see that based on these projections, the US's economy by itself is roughly the same size as all of Europe, roughly the same size as all of the major countries in Asia, and so the US is really a gigantic part of the world economy.